Prologue of John is telling two stories at one time. It is telling the story of the Old Testament in a way that is supposed to unveil that there was this new meaning to the Old Testament that had been there the whole time, and we see that it had served as a foreshadow of what would happen in Jesus, and that the prologue is primarily bringing us from the Old Testament understanding into a higher New Testament understanding, and that this is what is accomplished and demonstrated in the prologue itself. I've been listening to Unitarians talk about the Prologue of John, and there's those two approaches. Are we talking mostly about the Old Testament, about old creation, sort of to build a background for then what happens in the gospel? Or are we focusing about new creation, the events of the gospel and the new things that happen in Jesus? And I would hear these debates back and forth and be like, oh man, that side has a really good point there. I'm like, oh, but the other side has a good point there, and they sort of seem to have a blind spot on this area or this area. And so I was just wrestling back and forth on those two ideas, and I thought, well, maybe there's a way that they could be both sort of right. And this idea that the first layer, this Old Testament layer, then has like a typology relationship to this new layer, where the author of the gospel is trying to get us to understand that the Old Testament has been building towards this the whole time, and that the Old Testament points to all these things that happen in Jesus. So when the author of the gospel is saying, in the beginning, we are supposed to think of Genesis. Yes, that's true. It sounds like the beginning of Genesis. That's supposed to come into our minds. But we're supposed to lift from that understanding to this new understanding, this new beginning that we see in Jesus. And once I started making those connections, I felt like I could have all of the strengths of each of the two different interpretations, but without their respective weaknesses. But the problem that I was kind of encountering, I'm like, well, this is kind of complex. It has the complexity of trying to unite two things. And if something's more complex, it can handle more information, but that might make it not correct. And so I was like, is the gospel really trying to do this? How can I see this? And looking at the rest of the gospel, where there was always these two layers going on in all these different stories, really helped me think that if this is such a strong theme in the rest of the gospel, then this is an appropriate way to look at the prologue. There are multiple stories in the Gospel of John where Jesus is trying to teach to the people of Israel. Sometimes it's a crowd of Jews, sometimes it's his disciples, sometimes it's an individual person like Nicodemus or the Samaritan woman at the well. And in a lot of these stories, Jesus is taking some symbol or story or person from the Old Testament, like in the Samaritan woman at the well. I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but there is a literal well that has been built by Jacob that brings literal earthly water to the people who drink from that well, and it gives them nourishment. And Jesus is talking about how he is a source of water that wells up to everlasting life, and if you drink from his water, you'll never thirst again. And this is a metaphor for kind of our spiritual new life that we get through Jesus. So Jesus is trying to take this example that the lady already understands, and that connects to Jacob in the Old Testament, and how this points to Jesus and helps you understand what Jesus is about, what his ministry is accomplishing, and what the spiritual true significance of Jesus' death and resurrection is for us. And so he's trying to do this, and the Samaritan woman story is actually interesting because she kind of gets it. She's like getting an intuition that this guy isn't just ordinary. You might be a prophet. Let me tell my friends about you. That's actually one of the examples where the audience is a little bit receptive. But there are many stories where the audience is not receptive at all, and he gets frustrated with them, or they get frustrated with him, and it can even turn violent. But so many of the stories in the Gospel of John have this structure where Jesus is using an example that he expects his audience to know and understand to try and elevate their understanding and reveal to them something new that is true about himself and his ministry. And I think that theme, that pattern that we see in many of the stories in the Gospel of John is compressed and most exalted and magnified in the prologue. I think one story in the Gospel of John that really helps demonstrate what I'm talking about is Jesus' first miracle where he turns water into wine. And so they're at a wedding. They're drinking literal wine that has grown out of the earth and fermented and turned into wine. The party's running out of wine. Mary asks Jesus to do something about it, and so he creates new wine. And then the wine taster at the party is like, wow, this wine that you saved for second is even better than the wine that came before. And I think that the miracles in the Gospel of John have theological and symbolic significance. It's not just like, oh, Jesus did something amazing. It's that it's trying to teach you something in addition to showing how powerful Jesus was. And I think that the old wine, new wine is actually a perfect metaphor for the sort of old creation followed by new creation, and that there's a double layer even in that miracle, where the new creation that comes to be through Jesus miraculously is like what came before, in that it's still wine and recognizable as wine, but it's even better and it's surprising and it keeps the party going, so to speak. One scholar that I point to in my presentation is Father John Baer, who's an Orthodox priest and theologian and professor, and he really emphasizes this theme of unveiling, this moving from earthly understanding to heavenly understanding. And so he talks about that a lot in his commentary on the Gospel of John. But he doesn't quite put that in the prologue in the same way I do, although he admits that most of the prologue is actually about the life and times of Jesus, and that Logos is something like a title for Jesus. So he gets pretty close and has a lot of the ingredients of what I'm saying, but it wasn't quite all there. And then another professor that I bring in he is not a Christian himself. He is a Danish philosophy professor and New Testament scholar. His name is Troels Engberg Petersen, and he has a lot of ideas about what the Logos is up to and what the Logos means in the Gospel of John that I think helps sort of dispel some common misconceptions about what the Logos is and what its relationship to Jesus is in the Gospel of John. And so I was taking these scholars, as well as a lot of the Unitarian people that I've read before, and also some influence from early church fathers, like I reference Origen. I think he's helpful in a lot of ways. I reference Paul of Samosata, a biblical Unitarian. I think he's helpful in a lot of ways. And sort of bringing all of these things together, I felt like I could use pieces and tools that each of these people gave me to fit it together in a new and compelling way. Troels Engberg Petersen talks a lot about this, that the sort of Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism sort of comes onto the scene in Christianity mostly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and that a lot of Christian philosophy thereafter is heavily impacted by that new philosophy. But that is at least 50 or more years after the Gospel of John is written that we start to see that philosophical influence on Christian theology. So his point is there must be something else going on that we can look to for philosophical frameworks to understand John in its context. And I was talking with Keegan about this, and that he's saying that, Sam, one thing that you could have emphasized more is that John is contextualizing his message. He is this Jewish, Unitarian wisdom, Christology stuff, but he is communicating in a very Hellenized Greek context in Ephesus, and so he is contextualizing his message in a way that his audience would understand and find compelling and persuasive. And so I think that a more Stoic understanding of what the Logos is, where instead of the Logos being a realm of abstract truths that has only vague effects on our present world and is mostly somewhere up above and beyond us, that the Logos is something that's very active and present within creation. That it is sort of the organizing principle underneath and behind everything that God uses to enact his will and his providence. And that spirit and Logos are sort of connected together. That spirit is sort of like when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, he says, those who are born of spirit are spirit. The wind blows where it goes and you do not, I can't remember exactly, but the wind blows and you don't see where it's going. The word wind there is actually pneuma. It's actually breath or spirit. It's not actually, there is no Greek word for wind other than spirit or breath. And so this pneuma Logos is active within creation. It's having effects. God is willing things and accomplishing his will and his wisdom and his purposes through his wisdom and logos in creation. And that's dwelling and acting in a specific, particular way within the human being Jesus. I think that this more stoic understanding of what logos is and how it interacts with creation helps make more sense and fits better with the Gospel of John than a more Platonic one that you can see in later church history.